Hello, Night Seekers, and welcome to Lacuna Noir. This is where forgotten stories and gentle voices meet, carrying you softly into peaceful sleep, wrapped in mystery. Before tonight's stories begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from? Drop a comment below and let me know. And a little note before we begin. You may notice a few brief ads in the first 10 minutes, but after that, the rest of the video is completely ad-free. Just you, the silence, and the stories. So settle in, get comfortable, and let the night carry you. If you're drawn to these quiet, shadowed nights, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tap the bell so you never miss a story when darkness calls. When I was young, there was one night that stayed with me in a way nothing else ever did. It wasn't like other childhood fears that fade over time or start to feel distant and unclear. This one never softened. It stayed sharp, almost unchanged, like something in my mind refused to blur or forget. I remember being in my room, lying in bed, completely awake. That's always been the one thing I'm certain about. I wasn't dreaming. I wasn't drifting in and out of sleep. I was aware of everything around me. The shape of the room, the position of the furniture, the quiet stillness that fills a house late at night. It all felt normal at first. The kind of quiet that doesn't feel strange until something interrupts it. I was just lying there, staring across the room. Not thinking about anything important, just letting my eyes adjust to the darkness. The kind of idle awareness that comes when you're not tired enough to fall asleep, but not awake enough to do anything else. And then something shifted. It wasn't a sound. Not at first. It was something in the corner of the room. At first, it didn't look like anything specific. Just a darker patch of darkness, slightly out of place. I remember focusing on it, thinking maybe it was my eyes playing tricks on me, the way shadows sometimes look different when you stare at them too long. I expected it to change, to disappear once my vision adjusted. But it didn't. If anything, it became clearer. Slowly, shape started to form. A figure, standing there, tall, taller than anyone should have been in that space. It didn't look like someone I knew, didn't look like a person who had just walked into the room. It felt separate from that, like it didn't belong to the same kind of reality as everything else around it. It wasn't moving. It just stood there, still in a way that felt deliberate. That's what made it worse. Not movement, not sudden action, but that complete stillness, like it didn't need to do anything to be noticed. Then I saw the hat, a top hat. That detail made everything feel more real, not less. It wasn't vague or uncertain. It was specific, clear enough to recognize instantly. Something about that shape, sitting on top of the figure, made it impossible to dismiss as just a trick of light or shadow. I kept staring, and then I saw its face. That's the part that has never left me. There was a grin, wide, stretched, not natural in the way a normal smile is. It didn't look friendly, and it didn't look neutral. It looked intentional, like it was meant to be seen that way. It felt aware, not just something that existed, but something that knew I was looking at it. And then there was the cigar. Even now, that detail stands out more than anything else. It was held in its mouth, clear enough to recognize, even in the dark. And there was smoke, thin strands rising slowly upward, curling and drifting in a way that felt real, not imagined. That's what made everything feel impossible to explain, because the smoke moved. It wasn't a still image. It wasn't something my mind could easily invent without everything else falling apart. The room felt frozen around me. I couldn't move. Not because I physically couldn't, but because something in me didn't know how to react. It was like my body had paused, waiting for my mind to understand what it was seeing before it allowed anything else to happen. Time didn't feel normal. It stretched. I don't know how long I stayed like that, staring at it. It could have been seconds, or longer. It felt like everything was suspended, like the moment wasn't moving forward the way it should have. The figure didn't come closer. It didn't move at all. It just stood there, the same expression, the same stillness, the same slow movement of smoke rising into the air. At some point, something inside me shifted. Not bravery, not a decision, more like instinct taking over. A sudden, overwhelming need to get away. And when that feeling hit, everything happened quickly. I got out of bed and ran. I didn't look back. I didn't check if it was still there. I just moved as fast as I could out of my room, into the hallway, and toward the stairs. My heart was racing, my breathing uneven, the fear fully catching up with me once I started moving. Upstairs, everything was different. The lights were on. My parents were there, painting the living room. I had forgotten about that completely until I reached them. The brightness, the normal sounds, the familiar feeling of them being there. It all felt like stepping into a different world. I started crying immediately, trying to explain what I had seen, talking too fast, not even sure if I was making sense. I just needed them to understand that something was wrong, that something had been in my room. My mom reacted the way you would expect, concerned, focused on calming me down, asking questions in a steady, reassuring way. But my dad didn't react like that. He didn't speak right away. And I remember looking at him, expecting him to say something, to explain it, to ground everything the way parents usually do in moments like that. But instead, he went pale. Not slightly. Completely. It wasn't confusion. It wasn't doubt. It was recognition. That's what made everything worse. Because in that moment, I realized he wasn't just hearing me describe something strange. He knew what I was talking about. He understood it in a way that didn't make sense. And that scared me more than anything I had seen in the room. I stayed upstairs that night. I didn't go back into my room until the next day, and even then, everything felt different. The space looked exactly the same. Nothing was out of place. Nothing suggested that anything had been there. But the feeling hadn't gone away. It lingered. Like something had happened there, even if there was no proof of it. For a long time, we didn't talk about it much. It just became one of those moments that sits quietly in the background. Not ignored, but not fully explored either. Years passed. And then one day, it came up again. I don't remember exactly how the conversation started. It wasn't planned. Just something mentioned in passing that led back to that night. And that's when my dad told me something he had never said before. He had seen it too, when he was a child. Not something similar. The same figure. Tall, wearing a top hat. The same kind of presence. He didn't go into every detail, but he didn't need to. The way he described it matched too closely to ignore. It wasn't just coincidence. It wasn't just two people imagining something similar in different ways. It was the same image, the same experience. And he had reacted the same way. Fear, confusion, and no real explanation. That changed everything. Because it took something that could have been dismissed as imagination and turned it into something shared. Something that didn't fit into an easy answer. That was the only time I ever saw it. It never came back. No other nights like that. No repeated experiences. Just that one moment, frozen in time. But it never really left. Even now, it sits somewhere in the back of my mind. Not constantly, not in a way that affects everyday life, but always there when I think about it. The figure in the corner. The slow curl of smoke rising in the dark. the way it stood completely still, like it didn't need to move to be understood. And more than anything, the look on my dad's face when I tried to explain it. Because whatever that was, it wasn't just something I saw, it was something we both did. And that's the part that makes it impossible to forget. It's one of those stories that doesn't sound real at first. The kind you hear from someone who heard it from someone else, and yet something about it sticks in your mind in a way that feels heavier than a normal story should. Not because of how dramatic it sounds, but because of how simple it is, and how easily things could have gone a different way. I didn't hear it directly from the person it happened to. It came from a friend who had heard it from someone they trusted. The details weren't exaggerated or changed for effect. If anything, the way it was told made it feel even more real, like it was something that people didn't want to think about too much, but couldn't completely forget either. It happened during an exchange program somewhere in Eastern Europe. The exact country wasn't something anyone seemed to remember clearly, or maybe it just didn't matter. What mattered was that she was far from home, living in a place that still felt unfamiliar to her, even after spending some time there. She was a student, just there for a short period. Long enough to get used to the daily routine, but not long enough to feel completely comfortable. Everything around her still had that slightly distant feeling, like she was part of it, but also just passing through. That night had been normal. Nothing about it stood out in any meaningful way. She had been out, maybe with friends, maybe just walking around the city. The kind of night where nothing special happens, where you don't expect anything unusual. By the time she started heading back to her accommodation, it was already late. The streets were quiet in that way they often are in smaller cities at night. Not completely empty, but still enough that you become more aware of your surroundings. The sound of your own footsteps feels louder. The spaces between streetlights seem darker than they should be. She was tired. Not the kind of tired that makes you alert or cautious, but the kind that dulls your awareness a little. The kind where you just want to get home, close the door, and not think about anything else. As she walked, she passed by a stretch of road lined with trees. It wasn't unusual, just part of the route she had taken before. Something familiar enough that she didn't really pay much attention to it. That's when she noticed something. At first, it didn't register clearly. It wasn't like she stopped and stared right away. It was more like something caught her attention for just a second. Something that didn't quite fit. There was something in one of the trees. She couldn't see it clearly. The lighting wasn't strong enough, and she didn't move closer to get a better look. It was just a shape, something darker against the branches, something that didn't look like it belonged there. For a moment, she slowed down slightly. Not enough to fully stop, just enough for her mind to try and make sense of what she was seeing. It could have been anything. A bag caught on a branch. Some kind of decoration. Even just a trick of the shadows. She didn't feel immediate fear. That's the part that stands out later. At that moment, there was no sudden panic, no clear sense that something was wrong. Just a brief moment of confusion, followed by a decision that it wasn't worth thinking about. She was tired. And when you're tired, your mind looks for the easiest explanation. The simplest way to move past something that doesn't make sense. So she kept walking. She didn't stop. She didn't go closer. She didn't turn back. Within a few minutes, she had already started to forget about it. By the time she reached her accommodation, whatever she had seen was already fading from her thoughts. It became one of those small, unimportant moments that you don't hold on to. She went inside, closed the door behind her, and finally allowed herself to relax. The space felt safe, in the way your own temporary home does when you're living somewhere unfamiliar. Not completely comforting, but enough that you can let your guard down. She might have taken off her shoes, maybe sat down for a moment, letting the quiet settle around her. And then there was a knock on the door. It came not long after she got inside. The sound was firm, deliberate. Not aggressive, but not casual either. She froze for a second. There's always that moment when someone knocks unexpectedly late at night. A small pause where your mind tries to catch up with the situation. You ask yourself who it could be, why they would be there, whether you should answer. The knock came again. This time, maybe a little more insistent. She walked toward the door. Not quickly, not slowly, just enough to reach it without making it obvious that she was unsure. Before opening it, she probably looked through whatever she had, maybe a peephole, or just listened more closely. A voice came from the other side. Calm. Official. The man said he was police. That changed things. Hearing that word shifts your thinking immediately. It gives a situation a sense of authority, of urgency, even if you don't fully understand what's happening. She opened the door. The man standing there looked normal. That's another detail that stays with people when they hear this story. There was nothing about him that immediately felt threatening. No obvious signs that something was wrong. He asked her a simple question. If she had seen anything suspicious that night. The question connected faintly to that moment on the road, the thing in the tree. For a brief second, that memory came back. But just as quickly, it was dismissed again. She didn't want to get involved. That's something a lot of people understand, especially when they're in a foreign country. The idea of dealing with local authorities, being pulled into something complicated, possibly having to give statements or be part of an investigation. She was only there for a short time. Whatever was happening, it didn't feel like something she wanted to be part of. So she said no. She told him she hadn't seen anything. The man watched her for a moment. Not long enough to be obvious, but long enough that, looking back, it feels like it meant something. Then he nodded, said something brief, maybe a thank you, maybe just an acknowledgement, and then he left. The door closed. And just like that, the moment was over. She went back inside, and whatever small sense of unease had been there faded away again. The mind has a way of smoothing things out, of convincing you that everything is fine once the immediate moment has passed. That night ended like any other. Nothing dramatic happened. No immediate consequences. Just another night that slipped into memory without much importance. Until a few days later. It was something she saw on the news. At first, it might not have even caught her full attention. Just another report, another story among many. But something about it made her look closer. A murderer had been caught. Details were being released slowly. There had been a victim. The body had been found. And then something connected. The location. The time. The way the report described where the body had been discovered. In a tree. That's when the memory came back fully. Not vague this time. Not something easy to dismiss. Clear. Sharp. The thing she had seen that night. It hadn't been a bag. It hadn't been a trick of the light. It had been a body. For a moment, nothing else made sense. Her mind probably tried to reject it at first, to find another explanation. Anything that would make it less real. But then another detail surfaced. The man who had come to her door. The one who said he was police. The report mentioned something about how the murderer had tried to avoid being caught. How he had gone back, checking if anyone had seen anything. Making sure there were no witnesses. And slowly the realization settled in. The man at her door had not been police. He had been the murderer. He had stood there, just on the other side of that door, asking her if she had seen anything. Not to help, not to investigate, but to protect himself. To find out if she had noticed, if she had become a problem. It changes everything when you think about it that way. That moment at the door, which had felt controlled and ordinary, becomes something else entirely. A situation where the outcome could have shifted in ways she never even realized at the time. If she had said yes, if she had mentioned the tree, if she had given any indication that she had seen something unusual, what would he have done? That's the part no one can answer, and maybe it's better that way, because the possibilities are not difficult to imagine. He had already killed once. He had already taken the risk of going back, standing at her door, looking her in the eyes. That alone says something about the kind of person he was. Calm enough to pretend, confident enough to test whether she knew something, willing to take another step if he needed to. And she had no idea. That's what makes the story stay with people. Not just what happened, but how close it came to becoming something worse. She had been tired. She had chosen not to look closer. She had chosen not to get involved. Simple decisions, normal decisions, the kind anyone might make without thinking too much about them. And somehow those decisions may have been the only thing that kept the situation from turning into something else entirely. After that, it's hard to imagine that she ever walked home the same way again, or that she ever ignored something that didn't make sense, or that she ever opened a door late at night without a second thought. Because once you realize how close you were to something like that, it changes the way you see everything. The streets don't feel the same. The quiet doesn't feel the same. Even the idea of safety shifts in a way that's difficult to put into words. And somewhere in that memory, there's always that image, a shape in a tree, something that didn't look right, something she chose to ignore. Not because she was careless, but because it was easier, because it was late, because she was tired, because the world usually makes sense, except sometimes it doesn't. It's one of those cases that feels disturbing not just because of what happened, but because of how long it went on without anyone realizing who was behind it. The kind of story that slowly builds over years, leaving a pattern that only becomes clear once it's already too late. In August of 1995, in the South Side area of Lafayette, a young woman was babysitting in a quiet home late at night. It was around 2 a.m., the kind of hour where everything feels still, where most people are asleep and the world seems distant and disconnected. She was alone in the house, probably expecting nothing more than a quiet night. There was no warning. At some point during the night, an intruder broke in. The details of what happened next are the kind that stay with people, not because they are complicated, but because of how controlled and deliberate everything seemed. The man wasn't careless or rushed. He knew exactly what he was doing. He had a flashlight, which he kept pointed directly into her face. It wasn't just to see. It was to control her, to keep her disoriented and unable to clearly identify him. He carried a gun, making sure there was no question about what would happen if she resisted. His face was hidden behind a mask, and he wore a knitted cap and gloves, leaving nothing exposed. Everything about him suggested preparation. There was no panic in the way he moved, no hesitation. His actions followed a pattern that felt practiced, like he had done this before. That alone made the situation even more terrifying. even if she didn't fully realize it at the time. After the assault, he didn't just leave. Instead, he led her to the bathroom. That detail stood out later more than anything else. He forced her to urinate and then to take a shower. It wasn't random. It wasn't something done out of impulse. It was a calculated attempt to remove evidence. That kind of thinking doesn't come from nowhere. It suggested someone who understood how investigations worked, someone who knew what evidence could be used against them and how to destroy it before it could be collected. When it was over, he left. And just like that, the house returned to silence. But the impact didn't end there. When the woman later spoke about what had happened, a friend of hers heard the details and felt something shift in a way that's hard to ignore. Not fear exactly, but recognition. She said the same thing had happened to her 3 years earlier. The words the man used, the way he moved, the control he maintained, even the detail of forcing her to shower afterward. It all matched. That's when the realization started to form. This wasn't an isolated incident. As more cases were looked at, a pattern began to emerge. There were other reports, stretching back years, all with similar details. The earliest ones dated as far back as 1984. Different victims, different nights, but the same method, the same control, the same careful steps taken to erase evidence. By that point, it was clear that there was a serial offender operating in the area. Someone who had managed to continue for over a decade without being caught. Even more unsettling was how close he seemed to be getting away with it. Despite his efforts to eliminate evidence, investigators were able to recover samples in several cases, not always directly, but from victims or from the environments where the assaults had taken place. In total, they gathered multiple samples over the years. When they were tested, they all matched the same person. One individual responsible for a series of crimes spanning more than a decade. The man became known as the Southside Rapist. But even with that, there was still no identity. What investigators did have were impressions, patterns in behavior that suggested something deeper about who he might be. There was something about the way he carried himself, the way he used the flashlight, the tone of his voice. Victims described him as calm, controlled, almost authoritative. Not just someone committing a crime, but someone who seemed used to being in control of situations. And then there were the words he used. He told his victims that if they reported what had happened, he would know about it. Not that he would find out, that he would know. That detail stayed with investigators. It suggested access, knowledge, possibly even a connection to law enforcement. It was a theory that felt uncomfortable, but it couldn't be ignored. Years passed with no clear answer. Then eventually investigators began using newer methods to analyze the pattern of the crimes. They developed a location profile, mapping out where the assaults had occurred and looking for a central point. What they found narrowed things down in a way that hadn't been possible before. The area of activity pointed towards someone living nearby, someone local, someone familiar with the neighborhoods. That's when a name came into focus. Ernest Randall Comeau was a sheriff's deputy living within a couple of miles of the locations where the assaults had taken place. He wasn't just any officer. He worked as a detective in the department's juvenile division, investigating cases involving physical and sexual abuse of children. On the surface, it was the kind of role that required trust, the kind of position people don't question. But once the possibility was raised, everything about it started to feel different. Then came an anonymous call. Someone reported that Comeau was, in fact, the man they had been searching for. At that point, investigators needed proof. They couldn't act on suspicion alone, especially not when the suspect was one of their own. So they found a way to obtain a DNA sample without alerting him. They learned that he had a routine during work, stepping outside for smoke breaks. It was a small detail, but it was enough. A cigarette butt. Something discarded without thought. That was all they needed. They collected it and compared the DNA to the samples gathered over the years. It matched every sample, every case. After more than a decade, the identity of the Southside rapist was finally confirmed. Como was arrested, and when confronted, he confessed. Not just to the 12 known assaults, but to additional ones that investigators hadn't even connected to him yet. For the people who worked with him, the realization was difficult to process. Terry Reagan, who had been leading the task force investigating the case, later spoke about the moment. He had worked alongside Como for years. They had known each other personally. They had shared time, conversations, a sense of trust that comes with working closely in the same environment. And suddenly, all of that was replaced with something else. The understanding that someone they knew had been responsible for years of harm. It wasn't just shocking. It felt personal. What made it even more disturbing was what came out afterward. Como had been investigated before. Not once, but multiple times. There had been complaints. One of them came from his former girlfriend, who had accused him of assault. She had warned that he shouldn't be working in the juvenile division, describing him as someone with dangerous tendencies. But those investigations had been labeled inconclusive. No action had been taken. He remained in his position. And during that time, the assaults continued. In the end, there was no defense from those who had worked with him. Once the truth was known, he was no longer seen as a colleague. He was seen for what he was, a criminal, someone who had crossed the line in a way that erased everything else. He was sentenced to multiple life terms in prison. But even that doesn't fully close a story like this. Because what stays with people isn't just the outcome. It's everything that came before it. The years where he moved through the same community, unnoticed. The authority he carried, which allowed him to control situations without being questioned. The way he understood exactly how to avoid being caught. And the realization that sometimes the person people trust the most can be the one they never think to suspect. That's what makes the story linger. Not just the crimes themselves, but the quiet, unsettling idea behind them, that he was always there, and no one knew. It's one of those memories that stays with you in a way that doesn't fade, no matter how much time passes. Not because it lasted long, but because of how sharply everything changed in a matter of minutes. It started out like any other vacation day, something light and easy. The kind of moment you look forward to without thinking too much about it. And then, without warning, it became something else entirely. It was the summer after a major election in the United States. Something that only really mattered because it ended up affecting the trip in a small but unexpected way. One of the cruise destinations had closed its U.S. embassy shortly after, which meant the ship had to reroute. Instead of stopping where it was originally planned, one of the days was spent at a private island owned by the cruise line. At the time, it didn't feel like a disappointment. If anything, it seemed like a bonus. The island had everything you would expect from a place designed for tourists. Clean beaches, clear water, organized activities, and just enough structure to make everything feel safe and easy. It was the kind of place where nothing really goes wrong. Or at least that's how it feels when you first arrive. For me and my mom, it was supposed to be a familiar kind of day. We had been on tropical vacations before, and snorkeling had always been part of it. It wasn't something new or intimidating. If anything, it was something we both enjoyed. There was a routine to it. You get off the boat, find a spot on the beach, rent your gear, and spend time in the water looking at fish, pointing things out, laughing about small moments. That's what we expected. When we got off the ship, everything followed that same pattern. The sun was bright, but not overwhelming. The air warm in that comfortable way that makes you feel relaxed almost immediately. The beach stretched out in front of us, and people were already scattered around, setting up for the day. We found a spot and picked out some clamshell chairs. It was simple, automatic. We placed our things down, got settled, and for a moment, everything felt exactly the way it was supposed to. My mom called me over not long after and suggested we go get snorkeling gear and some drinks. That's when something shifted. We walked over to the stand where they rented out snorkels and masks. There were people around us doing the same thing, picking out equipment, talking casually. Nothing out of the ordinary. It should have felt normal, but it didn't. The moment I got there, something in me just stopped. It wasn't a thought. Not something I could explain or reason through. It was a physical reaction, immediate and clear. My body went tense, like something inside me was trying to pull me back before I even had time to understand why. My mom asked me to pick a color. It was such a simple question, the kind you answer without thinking. But instead of answering, I said no. Not in a joking way, not in a hesitant way. It came out firm and certain. I told her I wasn't snorkeling. The people behind us in line probably noticed the sudden shift, because I stepped aside and told them to go ahead. My mom looked at me like I was acting strange, which made sense. This wasn't like me at all. I was usually the one who looked forward to being in the water, the one who got excited about seeing fish up close. For a moment, she didn't say anything. Then she admitted something that made the situation feel even more unsettling. She said she had a weird feeling, too. Not something she could explain, just the same kind of quiet discomfort that had stopped me. It wasn't panic. It wasn't fear. Just a sense that something wasn't right. So we didn't question it. We walked away from the stand and went to the bar instead. It felt like the easier choice. Something light, something normal. We ordered drinks, pina coladas, and tried to settle back into the kind of relaxed mood the day was supposed to have. Eventually, we made our way into the water, not to snorkel, just to stand, to cool off, to enjoy the ocean in a simple way. The water was calm, almost too calm. There were no real waves. Just a steady stillness that made everything feel quieter than it should have been. We stood there with our drinks, talking, occasionally looking around at the other people in the water. Small schools of fish moved around us. Normally, I would have been curious, even excited. I'm the kind of person who tries to get closer, to identify what I'm seeing, to enjoy that moment. But that day, I felt different. Every small movement caught my attention. Every time fish got too close, I felt a sudden jolt of anxiety, like something was wrong even though nothing actually was. I kept reacting in ways that didn't make sense, stepping back, feeling tense, unable to relax. It didn't feel like me. About 30 minutes passed like that. Nothing happened. At least nothing that anyone noticed at first. Just people swimming, talking, enjoying their time. And then someone screamed. It cut through everything instantly. The sound of it changed the entire atmosphere in a way that's hard to describe. 1 second, everything was calm. The next, it wasn't. People started turning, trying to figure out where it came from. That's when they saw her. A woman, maybe around 50 years old, floating face down in the water. She still had her snorkel gear on. At first, it didn't even register as something serious. From a distance, it could have looked like she was just floating. looking at fish the way people do when they snorkel. But something about the stillness was wrong. Her daughter had been nearby. She had assumed her mother was fine, just focused on what was beneath the surface. The snorkel tube was still above the water, which made it seem like she was breathing, like everything was normal, until it wasn't. When they reached her and turned her over, everything changed. The moment her mask was removed, blood came out. From her nose, from her mouth. Not a small amount, not something that could be dismissed. It was immediate and undeniable. The panic spread quickly after that. My mom and I reacted without thinking. We were both CPR certified, and instinct took over. We moved toward the scene, not really aware of anything except the need to help. But we weren't the first to reach her. An island staff member got there ahead of us and started CPR. We stopped just short, watching. And what we saw is something I don't think either of us will ever forget. Every time pressure was applied to her chest, there was a sound, a crunch. Not loud, but enough to be heard. Her body reacted in a way that didn't feel right. Like something had already gone too far. Blood continued to come from her mouth, pooling and running down as the attempts to bring her back continued. Her daughter was there the entire time, crying, holding onto her, begging her to breathe. The kind of grief that doesn't hold back, that comes out all at once because there's no way to contain it. It wasn't something distant. It wasn't something happening far away. It was right there, close enough to see, to hear, to feel. Eventually, it became clear that nothing was going to change the outcome. The moment passed, but it didn't really end. The beach didn't feel the same after that. Nothing did. Later, people started talking, trying to understand what had happened. No official explanation was given. The staff wasn't allowed to share details, which only made people speculate more. Some thought it could have been a medical issue. Others believed there might have been something wrong with the snorkel equipment. No one really knew. But for me and my mom, that part almost didn't matter. What stayed with us was everything that had happened before. The moment at the snorkel stand, the sudden refusal, the shared feeling that something wasn't right. It's easy to dismiss things like that, to call it coincidence, or luck, or just a strange moment that doesn't mean anything. But when you look back at it, it feels different. Because if we had followed our usual routine, we would have been out there, using the same kind of equipment, doing exactly what she had been doing. And maybe nothing would have happened. Or maybe something would have. There's no way to know. And that's the part that stays with you. The idea that sometimes, without any clear reason, something inside you tells you to stop, to step back, to choose a different path. And when you listen to it, you don't always understand why. Not in the moment. Only later, when everything has already happened. When the pieces fall into place in a way you never expected. Even now, thinking about it brings back that same feeling. Not fear exactly, but something close to it. A quiet awareness of how quickly things can change, and how sometimes the smallest decisions, the ones that don't seem important at all, can be the ones that matter the most. It's one of those stories that feels different from the very beginning. Not because it sounds exaggerated or unrealistic, but because of how close it sits to everyday life. There's nothing distant about it. No unfamiliar setting or strange circumstances to create distance. Instead, it unfolds in a place that feels ordinary, in a community that looks like so many others, with routines that people follow without thinking twice. That's what makes it harder to ignore. It doesn't feel like something from far away. It feels like something that could exist just around the corner, hidden in plain sight. This happened about 2 years ago in Whitehall, not far from Charlottesville. The distance between the two places isn't much, maybe a 20-minute drive at most. That detail alone makes it more unsettling. It's not somewhere distant or unknown. It's close enough that you can picture the roads, the quiet stretches of houses, the kind of places people pass through every day without a second thought. You can imagine yourself driving through there, going about your routine, completely unaware that something like this could be unfolding behind one of those doors. The person at the center of it wasn't a stranger, in the way people usually expect when they hear about something disturbing. He wasn't someone completely unknown to the community. In fact, he had gone to the same high school as me, just a couple of grades ahead. I didn't know him personally. We never spoke, but I knew of him. The kind of distant familiarity that doesn't mean much at the time. Just another face you recognize in passing. Someone who existed in the same space for a while, and then moved on. It's the kind of connection you don't think about again until something like this happens, and suddenly it feels much more significant than it ever should have. When the news first came out, it sounded serious, but still something people could process in a controlled way. He had been arrested on multiple charges related to illegal material involving children. It was disturbing, of course. There was no way around that. But it still fit into a category people, unfortunately, have become used to hearing about. It felt contained, defined. Something terrible, but something that stayed within the boundaries of what was being reported. That's how most people understood it at first. Conversations about it stayed at the surface level. People expressed shock, maybe disgust, but it didn't go much deeper than that. It was something you talked about briefly, shook your head at, and then tried to move on from. The details that were publicly available didn't suggest anything beyond what had already been confirmed. But over time, more information began to circulate. Not through official channels, not through news reports or public statements. It spread quietly, through conversations. The kind that happen in private, between people who have some kind of connection to the situation. It didn't come all at once. It built slowly, piece by piece, each new detail making the situation feel heavier than before. A close friend of mine had a father who worked as a police officer in the area. He was part of the department involved in the case. He wasn't someone who spoke openly about his work, and nothing he shared was official. But the small things he mentioned changed how the situation was understood. When law enforcement searched the man's house, they didn't just find digital evidence. They went into the basement. And what they found there didn't match what people had imagined. The space had been deliberately altered. It wasn't a normal basement used for storage or everyday activities. It had been turned into something else entirely. Something intentional. The kind of space that didn't happen by accident. It showed planning, time, and a clear purpose behind it. Along the walls, there were fixtures that had been carefully placed. There were padlocks arranged in a way that suggested more than just casual interest. It wasn't about collecting them. It looked like someone had spent time understanding them, practicing with them, learning how they worked, how they could be open, how they could be controlled. It didn't feel like a hobby. It felt like preparation. There was also equipment that appeared designed to restrain someone. It wasn't makeshift or random. It was placed with intention. Everything about the space suggested control, planning, a quiet kind of preparation that had taken time to build. It didn't feel chaotic. It felt organized, which somehow made it worse. That's when the situation began to feel different. because it no longer seemed like it was only about what had already happened. It started to feel like it was about what might have happened next. According to what was shared privately, investigators also found written plans. Not vague ideas or scattered thoughts, but something more direct, something that suggested focus. There was mention of a specific target, a young girl, around 12 years old. Someone he had identified, someone he had paid attention to in a way that made it clear this wasn't random. The plan involved entering a home at night, using lockpicking to get inside quietly, taking her, bringing her back. It's at that point that everything shifts, because the story stops being just about past actions and becomes something else entirely. Something that hadn't happened yet, but felt close enough to reality that it's hard to separate the two. It creates a different kind of fear, not based on what was done, but on what was almost done. None of those details were part of the official reports. The articles people read focused on what could be confirmed, what could be proven, what could be presented in a way that met legal standards. They kept the story contained within those limits, controlled, measured. But the version that moved through the community felt different, heavier, more difficult to process. It wasn't something people talked about openly. It didn't come up in loud conversations or public discussions. It stayed quiet, passed between people in careful ways, almost like no one wanted to say too much out loud. And once you hear something like that, it changes how you see things. Not all at once, not in a way that's dramatic or obvious, but slowly. You start thinking about how normal everything seemed before, how someone could live in a regular house in an ordinary neighborhood and hide something like that without anyone noticing. How whatever signs might have been there were either missed or never questioned. You think about how close it came. How situations like this don't just affect one person. They have the potential to reach much further, to change how people see their surroundings, how they think about safety, how they trust the idea that things are as they appear. And then there's the timing, the fact that it didn't happen. Not because it couldn't have, but because it didn't get the chance to. It's hard not to think about how easily things could have been different. If the investigation had been delayed, if certain evidence hadn't been found when it was, if those plans had moved forward even a little further. Those thoughts don't really lead anywhere. They don't have answers, but they stay there, quietly, in the background. Even now, when people talk about it, they don't do it loudly. There's no need for exaggeration, no need to add anything extra to make it feel more disturbing, because it already is. And maybe that's what makes it stay with you. Not just what was discovered, but how easily it could have gone further. How something like that can exist so close to normal life without being seen. And how sometimes the difference between what almost happens and what actually does comes down to timing, in a way no one can fully explain. After hearing a story like that, it becomes harder to look at ordinary places in the same way. A quiet neighborhood doesn't feel quite as simple as it once did. A house doesn't always feel like just a house. There's a lingering awareness that not everything is visible, not everything is obvious, and not everything reveals itself until it's too late. And that realization doesn't fade quickly. It settles in slowly and stays. Sorry to pause for just a moment. If this is your first time here, welcome. I hope you're enjoying the calm so far. If you'd like more nights like this, true stories, gentle rain, no interruptions, please subscribe to Lacuna Noir. It really helps me keep creating these peaceful experiences for you. And tap the bell so you're here every time a new story arrives in the dark. Now, Back to the story. It was told to me in a very calm, matter-of-fact way, which somehow made it sit heavier than if it had been told with emotion. The person who shared it was a police officer, someone who had seen enough over the years that very little seemed to shock him anymore. He didn't tell it like a dramatic story. If anything, he spoke about it like it was just another part of the job, one of those situations that shouldn't be normal, but somehow becomes routine after enough time. That was the part that stayed with me, not just what happened, but how easily it fit into his world. The incident itself had taken place at a local train station. Nothing unusual about the location. The kind of place people pass through every day without giving it a second thought. Commuters coming and going, people waiting on platforms, the steady rhythm of trains arriving and leaving on schedule. It's the kind of environment that feels structured and predictable, where everything's supposed to follow a clear path. But sometimes, in a single moment, that order breaks in a way that changes everything. Someone had stepped in front of a train. He explained it in a way that was almost clinical, like he had gone over it many times before. According to him, when something like that happens, there are usually only two possible outcomes. Neither of them is something most people ever want to think about. And hearing it described so plainly made it even harder to process. In one scenario, the body is caught at the front of the train, pinned and carried forward for a long distance before the train can come to a complete stop. In the other, the person falls beneath the train, and what follows is something much more scattered, something that doesn't stay in one place. This time, it was the second situation. There wasn't much else said about the person themselves. No background, no details about who they were or why it happened. Just the result and what came after. Because once the train had passed and everything had come to a stop, the situation didn't end there. For the people involved in the response, it was only the beginning. He had been assigned to the scene along with a small group of other officers, and a dog handler was brought in as well. Their task was as straightforward as it was difficult. They had to walk the length of the track and recover what they could. It wasn't something that could be rushed, and it wasn't something that could be done from a distance. It required time, attention, and a willingness to focus on details most people would instinctively avoid. The way he described it, they moved slowly along the tracks, step by step, scanning the ground, the edges, anything that might stand out. It wasn't like searching for something large and obvious. It was the opposite of that. It required patience and a kind of detachment, the ability to keep going even when every instinct might be telling you to look away. The dog played a key role in that process. Trained for situations like this, it moved ahead of them, alert and focused in a way that only comes from repetition and conditioning. While the officers followed behind, the dog worked through scents, picking up on things that no human could detect. It was efficient, almost methodical, and for a while, everything stayed controlled and contained within that narrow stretch of railway. As they continued along the track, the surroundings began to change slightly. What started near the station gradually led them toward a more open area. Eventually, they approached the edge of a local high school's playing fields. It was one of those transitions that feels subtle at first, but becomes more noticeable the closer you get. The rigid, industrial feel of the tracks giving way to something more familiar, more everyday. It was during that part of the search that the dog reacted. At first, it was just a change in behavior, a shift in focus, a sudden interest in a specific spot. The handler noticed it immediately. There's a certain way trained dogs signal that they found something, and this was clearly one of those moments. The group slowed down, watching as the dog moved in closer, its attention fixed. From a distance, they couldn't see exactly what it had found. It was only as they stepped closer, reducing that space between them, that the situation became clear. The dog had something in its mouth. For a brief moment, there was that strange pause where recognition takes a second to catch up, where the mind tries to process what it's seeing before fully accepting it. And then it settled, heavy and immediate. It was an arm. Even in the way he told it, there was no attempt to soften that detail. It was stated simply, directly, without hesitation. The kind of clarity that leaves no room for misunderstanding. The officers moved in, doing what they were trained to do, trying to recover it properly, to take control of the situation. But the dog didn't react the way they expected. Instead of allowing them to take it, the dog shifted its behavior in a way that didn't match the seriousness of the moment. To the dog, it wasn't what it meant to the people around it. It didn't carry the same weight, the same understanding. In its mind, it had found something, and now it had it. When they reached for it, the dog pulled back, and then it ran. It wasn't a sudden, panicked movement. It was quick but almost playful, the kind of motion you might see when a dog thinks it's part of a game. It turned and moved away from them, carrying what it had found, ignoring the commands that followed. For a moment, the situation slipped out of control in a way no one had anticipated. And it happened at the worst possible place. The dog ran straight out toward the open field. At that time of day, the high school grounds weren't empty. Students were outside, spread across the playing fields, moving around in small groups, talking, laughing, completely unaware of what had been happening just beyond the edge of their space. To them, it was just a normal day. Nothing out of the ordinary, until it wasn't. From where they stood, the officers could see it unfolding in real time. The distance between the controlled environment of their search and the everyday world of the school collapsed in an instant. The dog crossed that invisible boundary without hesitation, carrying something that should never have been seen in that context. The reaction from the students was immediate. At first, confusion, a hesitation as they tried to understand what they were looking at. Then the realization began to spread, uneven but fast, moving through the group in a way that couldn't be stopped. Some froze, others moved back, and the normal noise of the field shifted into something uncertain, something unsettled. The officers ran after the dog, calling out, trying to regain control before things escalated further. The handler's voice cut through the space, sharper now, more urgent. It took longer than it should have, but eventually they were able to catch up, to bring the situation back under control. But by then, the damage had already been done. There's no clean way to undo something like that. No simple way to reset the moment or take it back. What had been seen couldn't be unseen, and for the people who witnessed it, especially the students, it wasn't just an abstract idea anymore. It had become something real, something immediate. The rest of the task still had to be completed. The search didn't stop just because of what had happened on the field. There was still work to do, and the officers had to return to it, carrying on with the same slow, methodical process as before. But the tone had shifted. What had already been a difficult situation now carried an added weight. Later on, after everything had been dealt with as best as it could be, there were other responsibilities to handle. Reports to write, procedures to follow, and in this case, a conversation that couldn't be avoided. He mentioned having to speak with the headmaster of the school. It wasn't a quick exchange. It stretched on, lasting far longer than a simple explanation would have. There were apologies to be made, questions to answer, concerns to address. It wasn't just about what had happened, but about how it had happened. How something like that could occur in a place where it should never have reached. The headmaster, from what he described, was understandably upset. Not in an aggressive way, but in the kind of controlled frustration that comes from trying to manage a situation that affects a large group of people, especially young ones. There were students to think about, parents who would need explanations, and the lasting impact of what had been witnessed. For the officer, it became part of the job in a different way. Not just dealing with the immediate situation on the tracks, but handling the aftermath, the ripple effects that extended beyond it. It wasn't something that could be resolved with a simple apology, but it was something that had to be faced directly. When he finished telling the story, he didn't add any kind of conclusion or reflection. He didn't try to explain how it made him feel or what it meant in a larger sense. He just stopped, like that was all there was to say. And in a way, that made it heavier, because it wasn't presented as something extraordinary or shocking within his world. It was just another incident, another call, another situation that had to be handled. The kind of thing that gets added to a long list of experiences that most people will never come close to understanding. But for anyone hearing it from the outside, it doesn't sit that easily. It lingers in a different way, not just because of what happened, but because of how close it came to something ordinary. A train station, a set of tracks, a school field, all familiar places, all part of everyday life. And yet, for a brief moment, those worlds overlapped in a way that felt completely wrong. That's the part that stays with you. Not just the event itself, but how thin the line can be between something routine and something that changes the way you look at a place forever. It happened during my freshman year of college, and even now, it's one of those things that never really leaves you. At the time, everything about college still felt new. You're getting used to the campus, figuring out your routine, learning which paths to take between classes, where people hang out, what feels safe and what doesn't. In the beginning, everything feels normal, almost predictable, like you're stepping into a place where thousands of people have lived the same kind of life before you. That's part of what made it so unsettling when everything changed. There was a girl, someone around our age, a student like everyone else. I didn't know her personally, and most people didn't, at least not directly. But on a college campus, that doesn't really matter, even if you've never spoken to someone. There's still a kind of connection, just from sharing the same space, the same routines, the same environment. You pass each other on the sidewalks, maybe sit in the same lecture hall without realizing it, exist in the same world without thinking much about it. She had been out late that night, coming back from practice. It wasn't unusual. A lot of students had late schedules, especially if they were involved in sports or activities. Walking back to your dorm at night was just part of the routine. Most people didn't think twice about it. There was a path that ran along the east side of campus, next to a small creek. It wasn't hidden or isolated in a way that felt dangerous at first glance. It was just one of those quieter parts of campus, a little more removed from the main buildings. There were a lot of trees, thick patches of brush, and the creek itself ran deeper than you might expect. The sides dropped down sharply, almost like a natural barrier, and once you were near it, the rest of the campus felt a little farther away. But during the day, it didn't feel threatening. It was just another path people used to get from one place to another. That night, she was walking along that same route, heading back to her dorm. There was a bridge that crossed over the creek, connecting one side of campus to the other. Students used it all the time. It was part of the normal flow of movement, something you crossed without even thinking about it. Somewhere near that area, there were cameras mounted on buildings across the street. They weren't focused directly on the path, but they captured enough of the surrounding area to pick up movement. Later, when everything was being investigated, those cameras showed her walking toward the bridge. They also showed someone else, a person on a bike, following behind her. At the time, that wouldn't have seemed strange. People were always moving around campus, walking, biking, coming and going at all hours. Nothing about that moment on its own would have stood out. But that was the last time she was seen on camera. After that, there was nothing. The details of what happened next didn't come out all at once. It took time, and even then, most of it spread quietly, through conversations, rumors, bits of confirmed information mixed with things people weren't sure about. But the general picture became clear enough. Somewhere near or under that bridge, the person on the bike caught up to her. What followed wasn't something anyone wanted to think about, but it was impossible to ignore. He forced her off the path, down into the area beneath the bridge, where the creek ran deep and the steep sides made it difficult to see from above. It was hidden in a way that most people never noticed, even though they passed over it every day. He attacked her there. It wasn't quick. It wasn't something that ended in a moment. It was violent, prolonged, and deliberate. And when it was over, he left her there, taking her belongings with him, disappearing back into the same campus that everyone else continued to move through without knowing what had just happened. That night, her roommates realized something was wrong. She didn't come back. At first, it might not have seemed immediately alarming. People stayed out late sometimes. Plans changed. But as the hours passed, that feeling shifted into something heavier. Calls were made, messages sent, and eventually, the situation became serious enough that it was reported. The search started not long after. Campus police, local authorities, volunteers. People began looking for her, checking the places she might have gone, retracing the paths she usually took. The area around the creek was part of that search, but it wasn't obvious. From above, the bridge looked like any other part of campus. You could walk over it without realizing what was below. And that's exactly what people did. For days, classes continued. Students followed their routines. People walked across that bridge on their way to lectures, to their cars, to meet friends. It was just another part of the day, something automatic, something you didn't think about. I was one of those people. My sister and I used that bridge constantly. It was part of our daily route, the easiest way to get where we needed to go. We crossed it in the mornings, in the afternoons, sometimes at night. It never felt unusual. It never stood out. Looking back, that's the part that feels the strangest. Because while all of that was happening, while life on campus kept moving forward like nothing had changed, she was there, right below us, hidden in a place we never thought to look. It took days before they found her. When they finally did, everything shifted at once. The quiet uncertainty that had been building turned into something real, something undeniable. The rumors stopped being just rumors. The weight of it settled over the campus in a way that was impossible to ignore. People talked about it in low voices at first. I'd like saying it too loudly would make it worse somehow. Then more openly, as details became clearer. There was fear, but also disbelief. It didn't feel like something that should have been able to happen in a place that had always seemed so normal. That sense of safety, the one that had been there at the beginning, didn't come back the same way after that. For me, it was tied to that bridge. I couldn't look at it the same way again. Every time I crossed it after that, there was this awareness that hadn't been there before, a kind of unease that stayed just below the surface, even during the day. It didn't matter how many people were around or how normal everything looked. The memory of what had happened there didn't fade. And it wasn't just me. The entire campus changed in response. The university took action, trying to make sure something like that couldn't happen again. The area around the creek was cleared out. All the thick brush and trees that had once made it feel secluded were cut back, opening up the space so there were fewer places for someone to hide. What had once been a quiet, shaded path became more exposed, more visible. At night, new safety measures were put in place. They organized teams of volunteer students, people who would stay out late and help others get across campus safely. There were rides available, small groups using golf carts to pick people up and take them where they needed to go. It became normal to see them moving through campus after dark, offering help to anyone who didn't want to walk alone. It was a good change, a necessary one. But it also served as a constant reminder of why those changes had been made in the first place. Even as time passed, even as new students arrived who hadn't been there when it happened, the story didn't disappear completely. It became part of the campus in a quiet way, something that lingered in the background. People might not talk about it every day, but it was there, especially for those of us who had been there at the time. For me, the memory is still tied to something simple. A path, a bridge, a routine walk that once felt completely normal. And the realization that sometimes the places you move through every day can hold something you never see, something you never expect, until it's already too late. At the time, it didn't feel like anything unusual. It was just another late night at work, the kind you don't think twice about when you're young and used to handling things on your own. Looking back now, though, it's one of those memories that shifts the more you sit with it. The details don't change, but the meaning behind them does, and what once felt routine slowly turns into something much harder to ignore. I was working alone that night, finishing up in a place that was quiet in a very specific way. It wasn't the comfortable kind of silence you get at home. It was bigger than that, stretched out across a large warehouse space that always seemed to carry its own kind of emptiness. During the day, it was busy enough, filled with movement and noise, people coming and going, equipment being used, doors opening and closing. But at night, everything settled. The sounds disappeared, and what was left behind felt almost too still. My office was right next door to the warehouse itself, separated just enough that you couldn't see into the main space unless you walked in. That night had been like a lot of others. I'd stayed later than usual, finishing things up, focused on getting everything done so I wouldn't have to worry about it the next day. By the time I looked at the clock, it was around 10. There was a kind of routine to leaving, something I'd done enough times that it didn't require much thought. Before heading out, I always did a final check, making sure everything was secure. Doors locked, lights off, nothing left open that shouldn't be. It was automatic at that point, just part of how the night ended. The warehouse door itself was open when I stepped out of my office, which wasn't unusual. I often went in and out throughout the evening, so it was normal for it to be left that way until I was ready to lock up. That night, though, I hadn't actually gone into the warehouse at all while I was working. I'd stayed in the office the whole time, focused on my own tasks. Still, there was nothing about it that stood out. I walked inside without thinking much of it, stepping into that large open space. Even now I can picture it clearly, the way the lights cast long shadows between rows of equipment. The faint echo of footsteps against the concrete floor, the sense of being the only person there. It didn't feel threatening. If anything, it just felt familiar. I headed straight toward the back door first. That was always the priority. making sure it was secure before anything else. The door itself had a simple setup. It bolted shut from the inside, meaning it couldn't be opened from the outside at all. If it was closed and locked properly, that was it. No one was getting in that way. When I reached it, everything looked exactly as it should. The bolt was in place, the door was shut tight. I remember checking it briefly, maybe giving it a slight push just to confirm it was secure. It didn't move. Nothing felt off. No sign that anything had been disturbed. So I turned around and walked back the way I came. There was no hesitation, no second thought. Just the same routine continuing as it always did. I stepped out of the warehouse, pulled the front door closed, and secured it from the outside with a padlock. That was the final step. Once that was done, everything was shut down for the night. And then I left. There was nothing about that moment that stayed with me at the time. No strange feeling. No sense that something wasn't right. If anything, it was forgettable. Just another night ending the same way as so many others before it. I went home, probably thinking about something completely unrelated. What I'd done that day, what I needed to do next, whatever plans I had. The warehouse, the check, the locked doors. It all faded into the background almost immediately. The next morning changed that. When I got back to work, it didn't take long to realize something was wrong. It started with the back door. From the moment I saw it, there was that instant sense that something didn't line up. The door was open. Not just slightly out of place, but clearly open in a way it shouldn't have been. And the first thought that came with that wasn't confusion. It was something sharper, more immediate. That door couldn't be opened from the outside. I knew that for a fact. I had checked it myself the night before. It had been bolted shut from the inside, secure in a way that made it impossible for anyone to get in that way. There wasn't any doubt about that. So seeing it open meant only one thing. Someone had opened it from the inside. That realization hit fast, but it didn't fully settle in right away. At first, it was just a piece of information, something that didn't quite fit. But as I moved further into the warehouse, it started to connect with everything else. Things were missing. Not just one or two items, but enough that it was obvious. Tools, equipment, things that had been there the night before were gone. The kind of things you notice immediately, even without looking too closely. It wasn't random. It wasn't small. Someone had taken the time to go through the space, to choose what they wanted, and to leave with it. And that's when everything from the night before came back. Not as it had felt then, but in a completely different light. I had walked through that warehouse while someone was already inside. They had been there the whole time. While I was in my office, working alone, they were somewhere in that space, hidden, waiting, or maybe just staying quiet enough not to be noticed. When I stepped into the warehouse to check the doors, they didn't reveal themselves. They didn't make a sound, didn't do anything that would draw attention. They just stayed out of sight. Even when I walked all the way to the back door, even when I stood there checking it, they were somewhere behind me or off to the side or hidden among the equipment. Close enough that if anything had been different, if I had taken a different path or stopped to look around, I might have seen them. But I didn't. I followed the same routine as always, focused on what I was there to do, and then I left. And after I locked the front door from the outside, I unknowingly left them inside. That's what they had been waiting for. Once I was gone, once they were sure no one else was coming back, they had all the time they needed. They could move freely, take whatever they wanted, and then leave through the back door, opening it from the inside in a way that had seemed impossible just hours before. At the time, when I first realized all of this, it didn't hit me as hard as you might expect. I was younger then, and there's a certain mindset that comes with that. A kind of feeling that things will work out, that you're not really in danger, even when the situation suggests otherwise. I recognized what had happened, understood it on a basic level, but it didn't fully sink in. I made changes, of course. I stopped working alone in the evenings for a while. It felt like the obvious thing to do, even if I didn't dwell too much on the reason behind it. It was more of a practical decision than an emotional one. Something had happened, so I adjusted. And then life moved on. But as time passed, the perspective changed. The distance from that moment didn't make it feel smaller. It did the opposite. It gave me space to think about it in a way I hadn't at the time, to really consider what could have happened instead of what actually did, because it could have been very different. If I had decided to potter about like I usually did, moving around the warehouse instead of just going straight to the back door and back out again, I might have crossed paths with them. If I had taken a little longer, checked something extra, paused in the wrong place at the wrong time, I might have noticed something I wasn't supposed to notice. And then what? That's the part that never has a clear answer. You can't go back and see how it would have played out, but the possibilities are enough on their own. Someone willing to hide inside a warehouse at night, waiting for the right moment to act, isn't someone you want to surprise in a confined space with no one else around. The more you think about it, the narrower it feels. How close everything was to shifting in a completely different direction. Now, when I look back on that night, it's not the missing tools or the break-in that stands out the most. It's the realization that I wasn't alone, even though I thought I was. That the quiet, empty space I moved through so casually wasn't empty at all. It just felt that way. And that's the part that stays with you, long after everything else has been dealt with. This happened a few years ago, maybe 3, but it still feels close when I think about it. Not in a constant way, not something that's always on my mind, but every now and then it comes back, clear and sharp, like it never really left. It changed something small but important in how I see things, especially when it comes to being out alone at night. Back then, I had a routine that I followed almost every day. I liked going to the gym late, right before it closed. For me, it was the best time. It was quieter, less crowded, and I could focus without distractions. The gym closed at 11:30 p.m., so I'd usually be heading home around that time, sometimes a little later depending on how long I stayed. Getting there and back meant walking about 15 minutes each way. It wasn't far, and it wasn't through some isolated or dangerous place. No, it was a small town, a well-lived-in area where people knew each other, where streets were familiar and predictable. I had been doing that same walk for around 3 years without any problems. It had become so normal that I didn't even think about it anymore. My mom never liked it, though. She hated the idea of me being out that late, walking alone. She would bring it up again and again, telling me it wasn't safe, that anything could happen, that I should go earlier or find another way. But when you do something for so long without anything going wrong, you start to feel like those warnings don't really apply to you. You hear them, but you don't really believe them. And I had my own reasons for feeling confident. I was in good shape, the kind of person who runs half marathons, who trains regularly, who feels comfortable in their own body. On top of that, I had some basic training in martial arts, things like Wing Tsun and Eskrima. Not at an expert level, but enough to feel like I could handle myself if I ever had to. That combination built a kind of mindset in me. I thought I was aware enough, strong enough, fast enough. I thought that if something ever happened, I would be able to deal with it. I didn't see myself as an easy target. If anything, I thought I looked intimidating enough that people wouldn't even try anything. That confidence stayed with me until that night. It started like any other. I had finished at the gym, stepped outside into the cool air, and began the walk home. I had my headphones on like always, but I never played music too loud. I kept the volume low enough that I could still hear what was happening around me. It was something I had gotten used to doing without really thinking about it. The streets were mostly quiet, but not empty. A few people here and there, the occasional car passing by. The normal background of a small town settling into the night. Nothing felt out of place. Then I noticed a guy walking toward me. At first, there was nothing unusual about that either. People passed each other all the time. But as we got closer, he spoke to me. His German was broken, not very clear, and he asked me for the time. It was such a simple, normal question. I didn't hesitate. I didn't see any reason to. I stopped for a second, reached for my phone, and said something like, "Sure, man," as I pulled it out to check. That's when things shifted. It wasn't sudden in a loud or obvious way. It was subtle, almost quiet, but something about the situation started to feel off. While I was looking at my phone, I became aware that the guy wasn't just standing there, waiting for an answer. He was moving, circling slightly, adjusting his position in a way that didn't match the situation. It wasn't aggressive yet, but it wasn't normal either. It was just enough to trigger something in the back of my mind, a small signal that something wasn't right. At the same time, I noticed something else. Out of the corner of my eye, from the direction I had just come from, another guy was approaching. He hadn't been there before, or at least I hadn't noticed him. Now he was getting closer, and the timing didn't feel like a coincidence. Then there was a sound, a slight movement from a nearby bush. Something small, but clear enough because of how low my headphone volume was. If I had been listening to music loudly, I probably wouldn't have heard it at all. In that moment, everything connected. The guy in front of me, the second one approaching, the noise from the side. It wasn't random. It was coordinated. I wasn't dealing with one person. There were at least three. And suddenly, all that confidence I had built up over the years didn't feel the same anymore. It didn't disappear completely, but it shifted into something else, something more grounded in reality. That's when I remembered something my Eskrima teacher had told me. It was simple, direct advice, the kind that sticks with you even if you don't think about it often. He had said that if you're facing 3 or more people at once, you don't try to fight. It doesn't matter how good you think you are. Numbers matter. They will overwhelm you. If that situation ever happens, you run. That thought came to me instantly, without effort. And I didn't hesitate. I didn't wait to see what they would do next. I didn't try to stand my ground or prove anything. I didn't give myself time to second-guess the decision. I just ran. It wasn't controlled or planned. It was pure instinct, driven by adrenaline hitting all at once. My body reacted faster than my mind could fully process, and I took off in the first direction that felt like it would get me away from them. Behind me, I heard movement. They reacted immediately, shouting and starting to run as well. The situation had gone from uncertain to very real in a matter of seconds. Whatever they had planned, it was now clear that I had interrupted it by not playing along. The night itself made everything feel even more intense. There was a storm, one of the worst lightning storms I had ever experienced. The wind was strong enough to pick up small debris, even small rocks, and send them moving across the ground. The air felt chaotic, unpredictable. But none of that mattered. Not compared to what was happening behind me. I ran in ways that didn't make sense. Not in straight lines. Not along the usual route I would take home. I turned corners randomly. Changed direction whenever I could. Anything to make it harder for them to follow me. It wasn't about getting home quickly anymore. It was about not being predictable. My heart was racing, my breathing uneven, but I didn't slow down. Every sound behind me felt amplified. Every second stretched out. I didn't look back much because I didn't want to lose focus or slow myself down. I just kept moving, pushing myself harder than I ever had before. Eventually, I lost them. I don't know exactly when it happened. There wasn't a clear moment where I could say, this is when I'm safe. It was more gradual. The sounds faded, the shouting stopped, and after a while it became clear that they weren't right behind me anymore. But I didn't stop right away. I kept going until I reached home, until I was inside, with the door closed and locked. Only then did it start to sink in. What had just happened? My body was still full of adrenaline, but my mind was catching up. I called the police, explained what had happened as clearly as I could. The location, the description of the men, everything I could remember. It felt strange saying it out loud, turning something that had just been pure instinct into a sequence of details. After that, all I could do was wait. Later, I found out they had been caught. Not just for what they tried to do to me, but for something much worse. They were connected to a case involving 2 other victims. Men like me who hadn't been as lucky. What had happened to them was something I don't even like to think about in detail. It was enough to know that they had been targeted, hurt, and killed. That realization changed everything. Up until that point, it had been a close call. Something serious, something dangerous, but still something I had escaped. After learning that, it became something else entirely. It wasn't just about what could have happened. It was about what had already happened to others. I had been in the same kind of situation, at the same point in their plan, and the only difference was that I had reacted in time. I had run. Now, when I think back on it, that's the part that stands out the most. Not the fear in the moment, not even the chase itself, but how close it came to going a completely different way. At the time, I thought I was prepared for anything. I thought my fitness, my training, my awareness were enough. But in that moment, the most important decision wasn't to fight. It was to leave. And now, even though most nights are still quiet, even though nothing like that has happened again, there's a part of me that stays more alert than it used to. Walking alone in the dark doesn't feel the same anymore. It's not constant fear, not something that stops me from living normally, but it's there. A reminder that sometimes the situation you think you understand can change in a second. And when it does, the only thing that matters is recognizing it in time. There's something about places that are designed to confuse you that feels wrong in a way that's hard to explain. Not just complicated or poorly planned, but intentionally disorienting. Like every corner and hallway was built with a purpose you're not supposed to understand right away. The kind of place where, even if you had a map, it wouldn't make you feel any more certain about where you were. The building in this case looked ordinary enough from the outside. Just another structure in a busy city, something people would pass by without giving it much thought. There was nothing about it that immediately suggested what was inside. No visible signs, no obvious warnings. If anything, it blended in too well, which is part of what made it so effective. But once you were inside, the layout didn't follow the kind of logic most buildings do. Instead of clear, open paths, there were hallways that twisted and turned in ways that didn't seem necessary. Some of them ended abruptly, leading to doors that opened into small, empty rooms with no real purpose. Others connected in strange ways, looping back on themselves or branching off into narrow passages that felt more like something hidden than something meant to be used regularly. It wasn't the kind of place where you could easily find your way around, especially if you weren't familiar with it. There were also rooms that had been altered in ways that didn't make sense at first glance. Walls that weren't fixed in place, but instead could move or shift. Partitions that created the illusion of one space while hiding another behind it. You could stand in a room and not realize that there was more space just beyond what you could see, separated by something designed to look solid and permanent. And then there were the areas that had been built to contain sound. Soundproofed rooms, isolated from everything else. Spaces where anything that happened inside wouldn't carry beyond those walls. It's the kind of feature that might seem unusual in most buildings, but not necessarily suspicious on its own. There are legitimate reasons for soundproofing, depending on the purpose of the space. But here, it was part of a much larger pattern, one that only became clear when everything was considered together. Some of the rooms were connected in ways that weren't visible from the outside. Hidden passageways linked them together, allowing movement between spaces without ever stepping into the main hallways. It created a second layer within the building, one that existed parallel to the more obvious layout, but remained out of sight unless you knew where to look. Even the rooms themselves weren't always what they appeared to be. There were spaces that could be sealed completely, made airtight in a way that prevented anything from entering or leaving once they were closed. These weren't accidental features. They were designed, constructed with intent, connected to a system of pipes that ran through the building. From the outside, those pipes might not have seemed unusual, just part of the infrastructure. But their purpose, once understood, changed the meaning of everything around them. What looked like an ordinary room could be turned into something else entirely. The deeper investigators looked, the more the building revealed. Some rooms had chutes built into them, openings that dropped straight down through the structure into the basement below. They weren't large or obvious, not something you would notice unless you were specifically looking for them. But they served a clear function, connecting the upper floors to what lay beneath in a direct, efficient way. And the basement itself was unlike anything you would expect to find under a building like that. It wasn't just a storage space or a place for utilities. It had been set up with equipment that pointed to a very specific kind of use. There were large containers, vats that could hold corrosive substances, materials that could break things down over time. There were also areas designed for burning, controlled spaces where things could be reduced completely, leaving little behind. There were tables as well, not the kind you'd expect in a normal basement, but something closer to what you'd find in a clinical or surgical setting. Tools arranged in a way that suggested they had been used regularly, each one serving a purpose that wasn't immediately clear until you looked at the larger picture. What made it even more unsettling was how all of these elements connected. The rooms above, the hidden passages, the sealed spaces, the chutes, the basement setup, none of it was random. It was a system, designed to function as a whole. Each part led to another, creating a process that moved from one stage to the next without interruption. For a long time, this went unnoticed. People moved through the building, stayed there. I interacted with it without realizing what was built into its structure. From the outside, it continued to appear ordinary, just another place among many. But beneath that surface, there was something else entirely. Something carefully constructed and deliberately hidden. It wasn't until 1894 that things began to come to light. While the owner was away, police officers entered the building to conduct an inspection. At first, it may not have seemed different from any other search, a routine process, checking rooms, looking for anything that stood out. But it didn't take long for them to realize that this place wasn't like others they had seen. The irregular layout became apparent almost immediately. Rooms didn't connect in expected ways. Some spaces felt incomplete, as though parts of them were missing or concealed. When they began to examine the walls more closely, they discovered that some of them weren't fixed. Hinged sections could be opened, revealing hidden areas behind them. False partitions disguised additional space, making the building seem smaller and simpler than it actually was. As they moved further in, the hidden passageways started to emerge, connections between rooms that weren't visible from the main hallways, allowing movement without being seen. It changed the way the entire building was understood. What had seemed confusing before now had a kind of logic to it, even if that logic was deeply unsettling. The airtight rooms were another discovery that stood out. At first, they might have seemed like an odd architectural choice, but once the officers traced the pipes connected to them, the purpose became clearer. These weren't just sealed spaces. They were part of a system that allowed gas to be introduced from outside the room, filling it while preventing anything from escaping. It wasn't a theory. It was a design. The chutes were found as well, linking the upper floors directly to the basement. When the officers followed them down, they saw where they led and how they fit into everything else they had already uncovered. By that point, the pattern was impossible to ignore. The basement confirmed it. Everything there pointed to a process that had been carried out repeatedly. The vats, the materials, the tables, the tools, they weren't out of place by accident. They were exactly where they were meant to be, arranged in a way that supported the system built above. And when you looked at it all together, it formed something complete. Not a series of random features, but a single, connected structure, designed with a specific purpose in mind. That's what makes it so difficult to think about. Not just the individual elements, but the way they all fit together, the planning behind it, the intention. The fact that it existed in a place where people moved freely, unaware of what was built into the walls around them. It's easy to think of buildings as static, predictable things, spaces that serve clear purposes, where every room has a reason and every hallway leads somewhere logical. But this was something different, a place where the design itself was part of the story. And once you understand that, it changes the way you look at it entirely. It was supposed to be a normal trip, nothing out of the ordinary. Me and a few friends had gone camping before, and this was just another one of those weekends where everything felt simple and familiar. We were around 11 at the time, still young enough to see it as an adventure, but not really old enough to think too deeply about what could go wrong. There were adults with us, so in our minds, that meant everything was safe. That was all the reassurance we needed. The campsite itself wasn't anything unusual. It was a fairly open area surrounded by trees with enough space to set up a few tents without feeling crowded. During the day, it felt like any other place in nature. Quiet, but in a peaceful way. You could hear birds, the wind moving through the trees, small sounds that made it feel alive but not threatening. We set up our tents, unpacked what we needed, and then drove to a nearby store to grab supplies. That part felt routine, like something we had done on every other trip. Snacks, drinks, things for the fire. Nothing about that moment stood out. It was just the beginning of what we thought would be another normal night. When we got back, we spent the evening the way people usually do when they're camping. sitting around a campfire, talking, messing around, staying up later than we probably should have. The fire gave off just enough light to keep the darkness at a distance, and as long as we were all sitting together, everything felt fine, safe even. Eventually, though, the night settled in properly. The fire burned lower, people started getting tired, and one by one we all went to our tents. I was sharing mine with a friend, and at first, everything felt exactly the same as it always had. That quiet you get in the middle of the night when everything slows down, when the sounds from earlier fade away and you're left with something much more still. That's when we heard it. At first, it didn't seem like anything serious. Just a noise somewhere outside the tent. It sounded like an animal moving around, which wasn't unusual. We were camping, after all. There were always small sounds in the distance, things you noticed for a second and then ignored, so we didn't react. We just stayed where we were, trying to settle down and go to sleep. But the sound didn't go away, it changed. What had seemed distant started to feel closer, more defined. Instead of something random, it started to sound more deliberate, like movement with direction, like something that wasn't just passing by, but actually coming closer. That's when it started to feel wrong. We didn't say anything at first. I think we were both thinking the same thing, but didn't want to be the one to say it out loud. There's a moment like that sometimes where you try to convince yourself it's nothing, even when part of you knows it isn't. The sound kept getting closer. And then it started to sound like footsteps. That's when the fear really set in. We stayed completely still, barely even breathing, listening as carefully as we could. Every small movement outside felt louder than it should have. The ground shifting, something brushing against the tent, sounds that didn't match what you'd expect from an animal anymore. We were too scared to call out, too scared to open the tent or make any noise that might draw attention. So we just lay there, frozen, hoping it would stop. Luckily, we weren't the only ones who heard it. One of the adults must have noticed something too, because suddenly there was movement outside. A voice, footsteps, someone getting out of their tent. The shift was immediate. Whatever had been out there reacted just as quickly. The sound moved away, fast. Not slowly, not casually, but like something that didn't want to be seen. After that, everything went quiet again. No one really said much. There were a few voices, some checking to make sure everything was okay, but nothing more than that. It was late, and I think everyone just wanted to believe it had been nothing serious. Maybe an animal, after all. Something harmless that had wandered too close and then run off. Eventually, we all went back to sleep. But it didn't feel the same anymore. The next morning made it worse. When we got up and went to check our supplies, it was obvious something had happened. Things were missing. Not just moved around, but gone completely. Food, equipment, anything that had been left out or stored nearby. That's when it became real. It hadn't been an animal. Someone had been there. Someone had come into our campsite while we were sleeping, taken what they wanted, and left without anyone fully realizing what was happening. At that point, the mood shifted completely. The excitement from the day before was gone. It didn't feel like a fun trip anymore. There was tension now, something sitting just under the surface. People talked about leaving, and honestly, that was probably the smartest option. But we didn't. We convinced ourselves it was over. Whoever had taken the supplies probably just wanted food. That was the explanation that made it easier to stay. It turned the situation into something manageable, something that didn't feel like an immediate threat anymore. So we stayed another night. Looking back, that decision feels strange, because deep down, something already felt wrong. That second night started the same way, but the atmosphere had changed. Even during the evening, there was this awareness that hadn't been there before. People were paying more attention, listening more closely, not as relaxed as they had been the first night. When it got dark, that feeling only grew stronger. Everyone went to their tents again, but this time it didn't feel as safe. And then it happened again. The same kind of presence, but different. More careful, less obvious. This time, it didn't move around the campsite in the same way. It didn't make as much noise. It felt more controlled, like whoever it was had learned from the night before. They knew how close they had gotten, and now they were being more deliberate. The girls' tent was set a little apart from the others, more secluded, slightly further from the center of the campsite. That's where he went. We didn't see it happen, not at first. What we heard was the scream. It cut through everything. Sharp, sudden, and full of panic in a way that made it impossible to ignore. It wasn't confusion or surprise. It was fear. Immediate and overwhelming. Everything happened fast after that. The adults reacted instantly, rushing toward the tent without hesitation. There was no second guessing, no pause to figure out what was going on. They knew something was wrong. By the time they reached the tent, there was already movement, a struggle, the sound of someone trying to get away. One of the adults, a man who was bigger and stronger than most, grabbed whoever had been inside and pulled him out. That's when it became clear. It wasn't just someone passing through. It was a man, and he had come back. There was no time to process it properly. No time to stop and think. Everything was moving too fast. The man was on the ground, there was shouting, confusion, fear all mixed together. And then instinct took over. Instead of staying, instead of trying to handle the situation any further, we all ran, straight to the cars. No one needed to say it. Everyone just knew that getting out of there was the only thing that mattered. Doors slammed, engines started, and within moments, we were leaving the campsite behind. No one looked back. Once we were far enough away, the reality of what had happened started to settle in. The shock, the adrenaline, the realization of how close everything had been to going even worse. The police were called not long after. When they arrived and we explained what had happened, it turned out this wasn't an isolated incident. There had been other reports, similar situations in the same area. People noticing someone around campsites, things going missing, strange encounters that didn't always have clear explanations, but they hadn't caught him. Even after everything, even after multiple reports, he was still out there somewhere. The area was eventually closed off for camping. It was the only way to make sure something like that didn't keep happening. But the man himself was never found. And that's the part that stays with you. Not just what happened, but the fact that it could have been worse, that he came back a second time, more careful, more intentional, that he didn't just take supplies and leave, but chose to come closer, to enter a tent, to target the most vulnerable. At the time, we got away. Everyone was okay. But when I think about it now, years later, it doesn't feel the same as it did back then. That sense of being young and untouchable is gone, replaced by something much more real, because now it's easier to see how close it all came, and how different the ending could have been. It's one of those stories that stays with you, not because it's complicated, but because of how real it feels when you think about it for too long. There's no mystery about what happened, no unanswered questions in the usual sense. Everything is known, and somehow that makes it heavier. It's the kind of situation where every step makes sense at the time, but once it's over, you can see how each small decision led somewhere that couldn't be undone. It happened in November 2009, involving a man named John Edward Jones. He wasn't reckless or inexperienced. In fact, he was someone who had done this kind of thing before. Cave exploring wasn't new to him. It was something he understood, something he was comfortable with. That's part of what makes the situation so unsettling, because it wasn't someone completely unprepared walking into danger. It was someone who knew what he was doing, entering a space that still managed to go wrong in a way no one could fix. The cave itself was known as Nutty Putty Cave, located in Utah. On the surface, it didn't look like anything extreme. Not some massive, dramatic cave system with huge open chambers. Instead, it was known for something much more specific. Tight passages, narrow spaces that required you to crawl, twist your body, and move carefully just to get through. For people who enjoyed that kind of challenge, it was almost like a puzzle, a test of control, patience, and awareness. That day, John was exploring the cave for the first time. He wasn't alone. His brother, Josh Jones, was with him, along with others. It started like most explorations do. Slow movement through the cave, adjusting to the darkness, the confined spaces. The feeling of being underground, where everything is close and quiet. Time moves differently in places like that. You don't measure it the same way. You just move from one passage to the next, focusing on where you are in the moment. About an hour into the exploration, he reached a section known as the birth canal. Even the name suggests what it's like. It wasn't a wide, open path. It was extremely tight, one of those passages where you have to move carefully, where even small mistakes in positioning can make things difficult. The kind of space where your body barely fits, where you have to control your breathing just to move forward. John went in head first. That's how those passages are often navigated. You lower yourself forward, guiding your way through using small movements, adjusting as you go. At one point, the space became so tight that he had to exhale just to squeeze through. That's when things changed. Once he passed that point, he wasn't in a horizontal crawl space anymore. Instead, he found himself in a vertical shaft, angled downward, with very little room to move. His body shifted into a position that he couldn't easily correct. Head down, feet up, his weight pressing against him in a way that made it harder to adjust. His arms became pinned under his chest. At first, it might not have seemed like a complete emergency. In tight spaces, it's common to get stuck for a moment, to pause, adjust, and then work your way free. But this wasn't one of those situations. He couldn't move. Not forward, not backward, not enough to reposition himself. And because of the angle he was stuck in, everything became harder very quickly. Being upside down in a confined space isn't just uncomfortable. It puts pressure on the body in a way that isn't sustainable for long periods. Blood shifts, breathing becomes more difficult, and the longer it continues, the more serious it becomes. His brother realized something was wrong. Josh tried to help, doing what anyone would do in that situation, reaching him, trying to pull him back, trying to shift his position enough to free him. But the space was too tight, and the more they tried to move him, the worse it became. At one point, the effort to help caused John to slip even deeper into the passage, tighter, more trapped than before. That's when it became clear this wasn't something they could fix on their own. Emergency services were called, and what followed was an effort that stretched far longer than anyone expected. Our rescuers entered the cave, working their way through the same narrow passages, bringing in equipment, trying to reach him in a space that wasn't designed for any kind of rescue operation. It took time just to get to him. And once they did, the situation became even more difficult to manage. He was stuck in a position that limited what they could do. There wasn't enough room to maneuver properly, not enough space to apply force in a controlled way. Every movement had to be calculated. And even then, there was no guarantee it would help. They worked for over 24 hours, trying different methods, adjusting equipment, attempting to pull him free without causing more harm. At one point, they even discussed extreme options, things that would only be considered in a situation where there were no good choices left. Despite all of that, there were moments where it seemed like progress was being made. At one stage, they managed to set up a system using ropes and pulleys. Slowly, carefully, they began to lift him, inch by inch, working him back up the way he had come. For a brief period, it seemed like it might actually work. They managed to move him a few feet, but then something failed. One of the pulleys broke under the strain. In an instant, everything reversed. The system collapsed, and John slid back into the position he had been in before, or even worse. Debris from the cave, loose clay and dirt, shifted with the movement, filling the space around him, making it even tighter than it had been. Any progress they had made was lost, and the situation became even more critical. By that point, he had been upside down for an extended period. The human body isn't built to handle that position for long, especially not under pressure in a confined space without the ability to move. His heart and lungs were under strain. Breathing was becoming more difficult. Time was working against him in a way that couldn't be stopped. What makes it even harder to think about is that he was conscious through most of it, aware of what was happening, aware of the people around him trying to help, aware of how long it had been going on, aware that the chances of getting out were getting smaller. After around 27 hours, his body couldn't keep up anymore. He died there, in that position, still trapped in the passage. Afterward, the situation didn't become easier. Recovering a body from a space like that is an entirely separate challenge, and in this case, it was determined that it wasn't possible without putting others at serious risk. The cave itself was eventually sealed, closed off permanently, with him still inside. It became, in a way, his final resting place. What makes this story stay with people isn't just the outcome, it's how it happened. The idea that something so small, a narrow passage, a slight shift in position, could lead to something that no amount of effort could undo. That even with people trying everything they could, working for hours, bringing in equipment, there are situations where there just isn't a solution. And maybe the most unsettling part is how quiet it all is. No sudden chaos, no dramatic moment where everything changes at once. Just a slow realization, building over time, that the situation isn't getting better, that it's getting worse. And there's nothing left to do but keep trying, even when the outcome is becoming harder to avoid. It's the kind of story that makes you think differently about places like that, about how something can feel like an adventure at first, something controlled, something you understand until it isn't anymore. Look, if you're still watching, you already know what this channel is. No jump scares, no fake drama, just real stories about real people who survive things most of us can't even imagine. And that's scarier than any movie could ever be. If you want more of this raw, unfiltered truth, told the way it deserves to be told, subscribe to Lacuna Noir. We're not here to waste your time. We're here to tell the stories that actually matter. Thanks for listening. Now go get some sleep, if you can.